When you think of Turkey, your mind probably wanders to Istanbul's glittering minarets, the otherworldly rock formations of Cappadocia, or perhaps the turquoise waters lapping against Mediterranean shores. You might even picture the bustling bazaars filled with spices and textiles, the aroma of strong coffee mixing with the salt air. But here's what most travelers never see, what most history books conveniently gloss over. Scattered across the Anatolian plateau, buried beneath wheat fields and volcanic soil, lie structures so ancient and so sophisticated that they fundamentally challenge everything we thought we knew about human civilization. These aren't just old buildings or crumbling temples. These are monumental stone complexes built by people who, according to conventional archaeology, shouldn't have possessed the knowledge, the organization, or the technology to create them. We're talking about engineering projects that predate the pyramids of Egypt by thousands of years, constructed during a time when our ancestors were supposedly just figuring out how to cultivate wild grains and herd sheep. Picture this: massive limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, carved with intricate reliefs of animals that haven't roamed those hills in millennia, arranged in perfect circles and adorned with symbols we still can't fully decipher. Imagine underground cities extending hundreds of feet into the bedrock, complete with ventilation systems, defensive mechanisms, and living quarters for thousands of people, all carved by hand in an era before metal tools were common. These are the prehistoric megastructures of Turkey, and they're rewriting the story of human development one excavation at a time. For decades, mainstream archaeology operated on a comfortable timeline. Civilization, we were told, began in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago. Before that, scattered hunter-gatherer bands, simple villages, maybe some early farming. The narrative was clean, linear, easy to teach in classrooms. Then we started digging deeper into Turkey's soil, and that neat story began to fracture like pottery shards beneath a trowel. What we've discovered over the past few decades doesn't just add footnotes to the history books. It demands we tear out entire chapters and start over. And here's the thing that should make your skin prickle with excitement and unease. Despite all our modern technology, our ground-penetrating radar, our carbon dating, our computer models, and academic conferences, we still can't answer the most fundamental questions about these places. Who built them? Why did they build them? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what knowledge did these prehistoric architects possess that was subsequently lost to time, buried under millennia of dust and forgetting? Today, you're going to journey with me across the Anatolian highlands, from the sun-scorched plains of southeastern Turkey to the honeycomb hills of Cappadocia, exploring sites that continue to baffle archaeologists, engineers, and historians. You'll encounter temples that predate religion as we understand it, cities designed for siege warfare thousands of years before armies marched in formation, and artifacts that suggest cultural sophistication in an age we've always dismissed as primitive. Some of what you'll hear is supported by hard scientific evidence. Some of it ventures into territory that makes academics uncomfortable, theories whispered in the corridors of conferences, but rarely published in journals. And some of it touches on legends so persistent, so widespread across cultures, that you have to wonder if there's a kernel of forgotten truth buried in the mythology. Keep your mind open, but your skepticism sharp. Question everything I tell you, just as archaeologists question every assumption when they brush soil from ancient stones. Because the real mystery isn't just what these structures are, it's what they tell us about who we are, where we came from, and what capabilities lay dormant in human consciousness long before we built cities and wrote down laws. The answers are out there, quite literally beneath our feet, waiting in the darkness under Turkish soil. But fair warning, once you see what I'm about to show you, you'll never look at human history the same way again. The first time archaeologists broke ground at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, they expected to find yet another medieval cemetery, perhaps some Byzantine ruins if they were lucky. What they actually discovered sent shockwaves through the archaeological community that are still reverberating today, more than 3 decades later. Rising from the edge of the Fertile Crescent, just a dozen miles from the Syrian border, this site defies every conventional model of how civilization supposedly developed. And it does so with such authority that scholars have been forced to completely reconsider when and how complex human societies first emerged. Göbekli Tepe, the name translates roughly as Potbelly Hill in Turkish, a mundane designation for something so extraordinary, consists of massive circular stone structures, some measuring up to 30 meters in diameter, each one defined by enormous T-shaped limestone pillars that have stood silent vigil over the Heron Plain for more than 11,000 years. Let that number sink in for a moment. 11,000 years? The Great Pyramid at Giza, a mere infant by comparison, built around 2500 BCE. Stonehenge? That came together around 3000 BCE, thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe was already ancient. When these Turkish megaliths were carved and erected, woolly mammoths still roamed parts of Siberia. The last ice age had only recently released its grip on northern Europe, and yet here, in this remote corner of Anatolia, people organized themselves to quarry, transport, carve, and precisely position stones weighing up to 20 tons each, creating architectural complexes that speak to astronomical knowledge, sophisticated artistic vision, and social organization that shouldn't have existed in the toolkit of Neolithic hunter-gatherers. The site contains at least 20 circular enclosures identified through ground-penetrating radar, though only a handful have been excavated so far. Each enclosure features those distinctive T-shaped pillars, some standing over 18 feet tall, arranged in concentric rings. The pillars themselves are masterpieces of Stone Age artistry, covered in elaborate bas-reliefs of animals: lions, foxes, wild boars, vultures with outstretched wings, snakes coiling around the stone, scorpions frozen mid-strike. Some pillars bear abstract symbols that might represent early pictographic writing, or might be purely decorative, or might encode astronomical data we haven't yet learned to read. But here's where it gets tricky, where the standard narrative starts to crack under the weight of evidence. Göbekli Tepe was constructed during the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, roughly 9,500 to 8,000 BCE, a time when conventional archaeology tells us humans were just beginning to experiment with agriculture. We're talking about people who supposedly lived in small, semi-nomadic bands, following animal migrations, gathering wild plants, maybe starting to cultivate some wild wheat varieties. These were not people who built monuments. These were not people who engaged in multi-generational construction projects, requiring hundreds of workers, specialized stone carvers, engineers who understood leverage and load-bearing, logistics coordinators who could feed and house large labor forces. And yet Göbekli Tepe exists, undeniably real, stubbornly refusing to fit into the neat boxes we've constructed for prehistory. The German Archaeological Institute team that's been working the site since the 1990s has found no evidence of permanent habitation, no houses, no hearths, no domestic refuse of the kind you'd expect from a settlement. This was a special place, a destination, somewhere people came to for reasons that had nothing to do with daily survival. Was it a temple? A gathering place for scattered bands who came together seasonally for ritual purposes? An astronomical observatory where priests or shamans tracked the movements of celestial bodies? Perhaps a school of sorts where knowledge was passed down through generations of initiates who carved their lessons into stone. The theories multiply like autumn leaves, each one grasping at explanations for what seems impossible. Some researchers propose that Göbekli Tepe represents humanity's first experiment in large-scale cooperation, that the need to build and maintain the site actually drove the development of agriculture rather than the other way around. Think about it. If hundreds of people needed to gather at this location regularly, they'd need reliable food sources nearby. Maybe farming didn't give rise to civilization. Maybe the impulse to build sacred, Spaces gave rise to farming. Other scholars point to the animal carvings as evidence of totemism, suggesting different hunter-gatherer clans identified with different creatures: the fox people, the serpent people, the vulture people, and that Göbekli Tepe served as a neutral ground where these tribes could meet, trade, intermarry, and share knowledge without the threat of violence. Still others note the site's elevated position and clear sightlines to the horizon, proposing that it functioned as an astronomical calendar, helping prehistoric communities track the seasons for optimal hunting and gathering. The absence of any depiction of domestic animals or cultivated plants lends weight to this theory. This is a monument from the very cusp of the agricultural revolution, built by people who still thought in wild terms, who understood the world through the movements of animals and the patterns of stars. Now, let's be fair. There's also a darker thread woven through some of the research whispers of ritual activity that makes modern sensibilities uncomfortable. Several of the enclosures contain stone basins and channels that some archaeologists believe were designed to collect liquid, possibly blood. Nearby excavations have uncovered the remains of elaborately carved human skulls, defleshed and modified in ways that suggest they were displayed or passed between groups as relics. Were human sacrifices conducted here? Did shamans perform rituals we can barely imagine? Ceremonies that bound communities together through shared participation in acts both sacred and terrible? The vulture imagery is particularly intriguing in this context, vultures being carrion birds associated with death and the recycling of flesh. In many ancient cultures, exposure of the dead to vultures was a common funerary practice, allowing the birds to strip flesh from bone so that the purified skeleton could be properly interred. Did something similar happen at Göbekli Tepe? Were the enclosures, with their carved predators and mysterious symbols, places where the dead were processed, where flesh returned to the world and bones were prepared for ancestor veneration? Picture yourself standing there at dawn, 11 millennia ago, as the first light breaks over the Taurus Mountains to the north, painting the limestone pillars in shades of gold and crimson. You're dressed in animal skins, perhaps some early woven textile, if your people have mastered that art. Around you, hundreds of others have gathered, people from distant valleys, speaking dialects you barely understand, bearing gifts of obsidian blades and carved bone figurines. The air is thick with smoke from fires that have burned through the night, and the rhythmic pulse of drums echoes off the stone monoliths. A figure emerges from the largest enclosure, face painted or masked, arms raised to the emerging sun. What knowledge does this person possess? What understanding of the cosmos, what grasp of mathematics and engineering, what cosmological insights are encoded in the placement of these stones? You feel it in your bones, a sense that this place is a bridge between earth and sky, between the living and the dead, between the wild past and an uncertain future that will see your grandchildren's grandchildren planting seeds in ordered rows rather than following the herds. And here's what keeps researchers awake at night, staring at excavation photographs and survey maps. Around 8000 BCE, roughly 1,500 years after the earliest structures were erected, the entire complex was deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned to decay, but carefully, laboriously filled in with thousands of tons of dirt and rubble. The pillars were preserved, the carvings protected, the enclosures sealed like time capsules. Why? What changed in the human experience that made this sacred site obsolete, or perhaps too dangerous to leave exposed? Was it the shift to agriculture, a fundamental change in how humans understood their relationship to the land and the divine? Did new religions arise that condemned the old practices, driving communities to bury the evidence of their ancestors' beliefs? Or was there something else, some knowledge or power associated with Göbekli Tepe that later generations feared, that they wanted to lock away from human eyes? We still don't know. The site sleeps beneath the soil, 95% of it yet unexcavated, holding secrets that might redefine human history or might deepen the mystery even further. What we do know is this. 11,000 years ago, people who supposedly knew nothing but hunting and gathering possessed the vision, the organizational skill, and the sheer determination to create something magnificent, something that would outlast their culture by millennia, standing as mute testimony that we have always been more sophisticated, more capable, more driven to reach beyond our immediate needs than the textbooks give us credit for. The Anatolian Plateau stretches endlessly, a high desert landscape where summer heat shimmers off bare rock and winter snow transforms the hills into otherworldly sculptures. Drive a few hours west from Göbekli Tepe, following ancient trade routes that connected the Fertile Crescent to the Aegean world, and you'll encounter another enigma, one carved not from limestone pillars, but from the volcanic rock itself. The underground cities of Cappadocia, particularly the massive complex at Derinkuyu, which translates with unsettling directness as Deep Well. Now you might be thinking this is a stretch, calling an underground settlement a prehistoric megastructure, but wait until you hear what archaeologists have discovered in the honeycomb depths beneath these seemingly ordinary Turkish villages. Derinkuyu alone extends 18 stories into the earth, 60 meters down through solid volcanic tuff, a vast network of tunnels, rooms, ventilation shafts, wells, chapels, storage areas, wine, presses, and communal spaces capable of sheltering 20,000 people, along with their livestock, for months on end. 20,000 people living underground, with adequate air circulation, food storage, water access, and defensive features that would make a medieval fortress designer weep with envy. The first thing that strikes you when you descend those ancient steps, worn smooth by countless feet over unknown centuries, is the sophistication of the engineering. This wasn't crude hole digging, this was three-dimensional urban planning executed with precision that modern engineers struggle to fully comprehend. Each level connects to the next through elaborate tunnel systems, narrow enough to be easily defended, but wide enough to move supplies and livestock. Massive circular stone doors, each weighing up to half a ton, could be rolled into place from the inside to seal off sections of the city, creating isolated zones if invaders breach the upper levels. These doors, carved from single pieces of rock, perfectly balanced on their axles, demonstrate mechanical understanding that supposedly didn't exist in the ancient world. They're positioned at strategic points throughout the complex, creating a cascading defense system. Seal the first door, retreat to the next level, seal that door, retreat again. An attacking force would face not just one barrier, but dozens, each one requiring them to break through solid stone, while defenders waited in the darkness beyond, armed with the home field advantage of knowing every tunnel and alcove. But here's where the chronology gets murky, where we enter territory that makes archaeological consensus dissolve into heated debate. When were these cities actually carved? The conventional answer points to the Byzantine period, roughly the 6th to 10th centuries CE, when Christian communities supposedly excavated the tunnels to hide from Arab raids and religious persecution. There's certainly evidence of Byzantine occupation, churches carved into the rock, crosses etched into walls, Greek inscriptions documenting who lived in which chambers. But the more we study these complexes, the more obvious it becomes that the Byzantines didn't create Derinkuyu and its sister cities. They merely renovated them, adapted them, added their own modifications to structures that were already ancient when Constantine converted to Christianity. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found in the deepest levels suggests occupation extending back to the Hittite period, roughly 1200 BCE and possibly earlier. Some researchers argue that the initial excavation could date to the Neolithic, making these cities contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe, carved by people who might have participated in rituals at that limestone temple complex before returning to their subterranean homes. Think about the magnitude of such a project. Volcanic tuff is relatively soft when freshly exposed, hard enough to hold its shape once it dries, and compacts. The carvers would have worked with bronze tools at best, possibly copper or even stone implements if we're talking about the earliest phases of construction. They would have started from the surface, excavating downward level by level, hauling out countless tons of rock debris, creating ventilation shafts that run the entire depth of the complex to ensure fresh air reaches the lowest chambers. These shafts are masterpieces of engineering in themselves, carefully angled to promote natural air circulation, wide enough to function but narrow enough to prevent invasion from above, some extending more than 80 meters from the deepest levels to the surface. How did they calculate the angles? How did they ensure the shafts from different levels didn't intersect and compromise structural integrity? How did they coordinate work across multiple underground levels in near-total darkness with nothing but oil lamps and torches for illumination? The scale suggests not just a local community project, but a regional effort, possibly spanning generations. Derinkuyu is connected by tunnels to other underground cities in the area, Kaymaklı, Özkonak, Mazi, forming a network that extends for miles beneath the Cappadocian landscape. Some researchers estimate that the full extent of these connected complexes could have housed more than 50,000 people simultaneously. Imagine that, an entire civilization living beneath the earth, emerging only when safe, maintaining agriculture on the surface while keeping their families, their food stores, their sacred spaces hidden from whatever threats drove them underground. What were they hiding from? That's the question that haunts this mystery. The standard explanation, religious persecution, invading armies, seems inadequate when you consider the commitment required to carve these cities. We're talking about centuries of work, generational projects, suggesting not temporary refuge, but permanent or semi-permanent underground habitation. Now, here's where we venture into more speculative territory, theories that don't make it into the official guidebooks, but persist in local folklore and fringe archaeology circles. Some propose that these cities were built as protection not from human threats, but from environmental catastrophes, perhaps volcanic eruptions, though the region's volcanism ceased long before human habitation, or possibly from atmospheric phenomena we don't fully understand. Ancient texts from various cultures describe periods of darkness, of ash falling from the sky, of years when crops failed and the sun was obscured. Could these underground cities represent humanity's survival strategy during a climatic disaster, a way to wait out years of surface inhospitability? Others point to the curious fact that many of the deepest chambers contain features suggesting religious or ceremonial use. Altars, carved niches that might have held lamps or offerings, communal gathering spaces far below the living quarters. Why descend so far into the earth for worship? What were they seeking in that subterranean darkness? Some ancient cultures believed the underworld was the realm of the dead, that descending into the earth brought you closer to ancestors, to chthonic deities, to fundamental powers that predated the sky gods of later religions. And then there are the stories whispered by elderly villagers who grew up playing in the tunnels before they became tourist attractions, tales of deeper levels that remain sealed, of passages that lead to chambers no modern archaeologist has entered. According to these accounts, the lowest accessible level of Derinkuyu isn't actually the bottom. There are blocked tunnels deliberately filled in that suggest the city extends even deeper into the volcanic rock. What's down there? More living spaces? Burial chambers for honored dead? Storage for artifacts too precious or too dangerous to risk near the surface? Or perhaps nothing at all, just the paranoid imaginings of people trying to add mystery to already mysterious places. But archaeologists have confirmed that significant portions of the known underground cities remain unexplored, either because they're too unstable to safely excavate or because they're deliberately sealed, and in some cases it's impossible to tell which. Picture yourself living there in the flickering lamplight of those carved chambers, your children playing in tunnels worn smooth by generations before them. You wake in darkness, descend to a lower level to draw water from one of the wells that tap into underground aquifers, the same wells that have provided clean water for thousands of years. You climb to the upper levels where your community has brought soil to create underground gardens, growing mushrooms and other crops that thrive in darkness. Perhaps you venture to the surface to tend your fields, always watchful, always ready to retreat to the stone door and roll it closed if danger appears. What kind of a worldview would such an existence create? How would it shape your understanding of safety, of home, of the relationship between light and dark, surface and depth? These weren't just practical shelters, they were entire communities living in a literal underworld, and the psychological impact of such long-term underground habitation must have been profound, shaping beliefs and stories that echoed through generations long after people stopped living in the depths. We still don't know the full story of who first carved these cities or why such an extreme measure seemed not just prudent but necessary. We don't know if they were always refuges or if they started as something else, mines perhaps later adapted for habitation. We don't know what threats, real or imagined, environmental or human, drove people to commit so much of their lives to excavating and maintaining these underground labyrinths. And we certainly don't know what secrets might still be locked behind those sealed passages, waiting in the darkness for someone brave or foolish enough to break through the barriers and discover what earlier generations chose to hide. What we do know is that beneath the tourist pathways and modern lighting, beneath the Byzantine chapels and Hittite storage rooms, there lies something older, something that speaks to a time when humans looked at the earth itself as sanctuary, when going down meant going home, and when the skills to create entire underground civilizations were passed from master to apprentice in the flickering shadows far below the sun. Journey now to the western coast of Turkey, where the land meets the Aegean Sea and ancient trade routes connected Anatolia to the Greek islands and beyond. Here, among olive groves and archaeological sites that draw tourists by the millions, stands a mystery that has perplexed researchers since its discovery in the 1860s. The submerged structures off the coast of Ayvalık and the underwater formations near ancient Lycia. These aren't natural formations. That much is clear from the right angles, the carved channels, the obvious signs of human modification. But they're located at depths and in positions that make no sense according to our understanding of ancient sea levels and coastal settlements. Stone platforms extending 50 meters or more along the seabed, arranged in patterns too regular to be geological accidents. Carved channels that once directed water for purposes we can only guess at. The remains of what appear to be harbors, complete with mooring stones and breakwaters, positioned at depths where no ships would have floated during the periods when we know these coasts were inhabited. The standard explanation involves isostatic rebound, tectonic activity, the gradual subsidence of coastal areas over millennia. It's true that sea levels have risen substantially since the last ice age, roughly 120 meters of rise over the past 15,000 years. And it's also true that the eastern Mediterranean is geologically active, with earthquakes regularly reshaping the coastline. So perhaps these structures were built at what was then the water's edge, only to be submerged as oceans rose and land sank. That would place their construction somewhere in the early Holocene, possibly contemporary with the earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe, making them products of those same mysterious pre-pottery Neolithic cultures that erected stone temples in the interior highlands. But here's the problem with that tidy explanation. Some of these structures show signs of sophisticated harbor engineering that shouldn't have existed in 8000 BCE. We're talking about L-shaped breakwaters designed to protect anchorage points from prevailing winds and waves, features that require not just knowledge of stone construction, but understanding of maritime dynamics, of how water moves and how to control it. Marine archaeologists who have studied the sites report finding worked stone that's clearly been cut and positioned by human hands, not scattered by natural forces. They've documented straight lines extending for dozens of meters, right angles that nature simply doesn't produce, arrangements of stone blocks that form identifiable patterns, walls, foundations, platforms. Some researchers have even claimed to find carved steps descending into the deeper zones, though these reports remain controversial and poorly documented. The challenge is that underwater archaeology in these areas is complicated by poor visibility, strong currents, and the sheer scale of the submerged zones. A comprehensive survey would require extensive resources, specialized equipment, and permission to excavate in waters where commercial fishing and tourism create competing interests. So most of what we know comes from preliminary surveys, underwater photography, and the occasional brave soul willing to dive deep and document what they find before currents and sediment obscure the evidence once more. But here's where it gets tricky, where legitimate archaeological mystery bleeds into the realm of alternative history and controversial claims. A handful of researchers have proposed that these structures represent evidence of a maritime civilization that flourished during or immediately after the last ice age, a culture that possessed advanced seafaring technology and built coastal settlements at a time when the Mediterranean coastline was kilometers farther out than it is today. According to this theory, as sea levels rose with catastrophic speed, and there's geological evidence for periods of rapid sea level rise, meltwater pulses that could have raised oceans by meters in just decades. These coastal communities were inundated, their buildings submerged, their populations forced to flee to higher ground. The survivors would have carried memories of the lost coastal cities, stories that eventually transformed into flood myths found in cultures around the world. This is the kind of hypothesis that makes mainstream archaeologists deeply uncomfortable, not because it's impossible, but because it implies a level of sophistication, maritime engineering, urban planning, possibly even writing or record-keeping, existing thousands of years before we have clear evidence for such developments. Critics point out, reasonably, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and a few underwater formations, however intriguing, don't constitute proof of a lost maritime civilization. They note that humans have always been attracted to coastlines, that people have built near water for as long as people have built anything, and that finding submerged structures off a coast with 15,000 years of human habitation shouldn't surprise us. They also emphasize that most of what's been documented could be explained by natural geological processes combined with limited coastal settlement activity in the early Holocene. Waves and currents can arrange stones in linear patterns. Erosion can create features that look artificial. And the human brain is notoriously good at finding patterns even in random data, a cognitive bias called pareidolia that makes us see faces in clouds and ancient harbors in natural rock formations. Still, for all the skepticism and methodological caution, the mystery persists. The Ottoman records mention mysterious ruins underwater off various Anatolian coasts, described by pearl divers and sponge fishermen who worked the depths long before modern diving equipment existed. These accounts, while not scientifically rigorous, suggest that the knowledge of submerged structures has existed for centuries, passed down through communities that make their living from the sea. Some Turkish archaeologists have documented what they believe are carved anchors and mooring stones at depths exceeding 20 meters, far below where any ancient ship would have moored in historical times. If these are genuinely ancient maritime artifacts, and that's a significant if, that requires more research to confirm, they imply seafaring technology in periods we generally associate with early agriculture and land-based settlements. They suggest that while communities in the interior were building stone temples and excavating underground cities, people on the coasts were mastering the Mediterranean, building boats capable of deep-water voyaging, and creating port infrastructure that could support maritime trade networks. Now, let's be fair. There's also a more prosaic explanation that deserves consideration. Many of these structures could be relatively recent, carved during the classical, Hellenistic, or Roman periods when the Mediterranean was crisscrossed by trade routes and every significant harbor was improved with human engineering. Earthquakes and coastal subsidence could have dropped these later structures below the waterline, creating the illusion of much greater antiquity. Without extensive excavation and dating of associated organic materials, wood from dock pilings, charcoal from nearby hearths, biological matter trapped in sediment, we simply can't determine with certainty when these underwater features were created. What we can say is that something is down there, something human-made, and whether it's 4,000 years old, or 8,000 years old, or somewhere in between, it represents a chapter of Anatolian coastal history that remains largely unwritten, submerged beneath the waves, along with whatever secrets its builders might have carved into stone. Picture yourself on a small boat in the Aegean twilight, the water beneath you so clear you can see 40 feet down to where stone structures lurk in the blue-green depths. You've brought diving gear, a waterproof camera, a sense of adventure tinged with apprehension, because there's something uncanny about swimming down to touch walls that were built by hands that never imagined their work would become part of the seabed. You descend through layers of temperature, feeling the water grow colder as you go deeper, your breath loud in your ears. And then you see them. The stones, arranged too perfectly to be natural, extending into the murk where even your dive light can't penetrate. You run your hand along a surface that's been underwater for millennia, feeling the barnacles and algae that have colonized every inch, wondering who last touched this stone when it was dry, when it was part of a harbor, or a temple, or a house where people lived their daily lives. What were they like, those builders? Did they watch with horror as the waters rose, as the sea reclaimed the land they'd worked so hard to shape? Did they load their families into boats and flee to higher ground, looking back at their drowning cities? Or did the inundation happen so slowly, so gradually, that each generation simply moved a little farther inland, never quite realizing they were abandoning their ancestors' achievements to the depths? We still don't know how extensive these submerged structures truly are, don't know if we're looking at a few isolated fishing villages swallowed by the sea or the edges of something much larger, a coastal civilization whose greatest achievements now lie beneath decades of sediment and centuries of marine growth. We don't know if future excavations will reveal artifacts that push back our understanding of Mediterranean maritime culture, or if they'll confirm the conservative estimates that place everything in the well-documented historical period. What we do know is that the Turkish coastline holds secrets in its depths, that every storm that shifts sediment and every earthquake that cracks the seabed potentially reveals more of what's been hidden, and that somewhere beneath the waves, stone structures wait in the darkness, as patient as they've been for thousands of years, ready to tell their stories to anyone willing to dive deep enough to listen. Deep in the Taurus Mountains of southern Turkey, where rugged peaks give way to high plateaus and ancient cedar forests cling to impossible slopes, archaeologists have documented a series of megalithic structures that seem to bridge the gap between Göbekli Tepe's sophisticated stoneworking and the later developments of the Bronze Age. These sites, Karahan Tepe, Harbetsuvan Tepe, and several others, are only now beginning to be systematically excavated, but preliminary work suggests they're roughly contemporary with Göbekli Tepe, or perhaps slightly more recent, dating to around 9,000 to 8,000 BCE. What makes them particularly intriguing is the way they seem to represent an evolution in religious or ceremonial architecture, incorporating elements that aren't present at Göbekli Tepe while maintaining that same unsettling sophistication that shouldn't exist in the Neolithic toolkit. Karahan Tepe, located about 40 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe, features similar T-shaped pillars, but with some notable differences that hint at evolving practices, or perhaps different cultural traditions within the same broad Neolithic world. Here, some of the structures are carved directly from living rock rather than being constructed from quarried stones. Imagine the effort. Instead of cutting blocks and transporting them, the builders of Göbekli Tepe looked at solid bedrock and decided to carve their temple directly into the mountain. They excavated around what would become pillars, leaving them connected to the substrate below, creating monolithic sculptures that emerge from the earth itself. Some of these pillars are decorated with the same kinds of animal reliefs seen at Göbekli Tepe: snakes, foxes, wild cattle. But others bear different imagery. Human figures with exaggerated features, abstract symbols that might represent celestial bodies or geographical markers, and in at least one case, a face carved in high relief, a haunting visage staring out from the stone with an expression that seems to shift depending on the angle of the light. The site also contains features that suggest more intimate ceremonial use than the open-air enclosures at Göbekli Tepe. Several chambers are partially subterranean, carved into the rock to create sheltered spaces. One particularly striking chamber contains a carved bench or platform surrounding the walls, with pillars emerging from the center, like a stone forest. The acoustics in this space are extraordinary. Sound reverberates and amplifies in ways that would have made chanting, drumming, or ritual speech much more dramatic. Was this an initiation chamber, a place where young people were brought to experience something profound, to be inducted into the mysteries of their culture? Or perhaps a gathering place for shamans, a sanctum where religious specialists retreated to consult with spirits or ancestors? The pillars in this chamber bear fewer animal carvings and more abstract symbolism, including repeated angular patterns that some researchers believe might represent early astronomical observations, constellations perhaps, or the phases of the moon encoded in stone. But here's where the archaeological consensus starts to fragment into competing theories. The more we excavate sites like Göbekli Tepe, the more obvious it becomes that the pre-pottery Neolithic people of Anatolia had a rich and varied symbolic universe that we're only beginning to understand. At Göbekli Tepe, excavations have uncovered pillars decorated with serpents in ways that suggest not random artistic choice, but specific iconographic programs. The snakes are always positioned in particular ways, always associated with certain other symbols, always carved with their heads at specific heights. This suggests systematic belief systems, possibly early mythology that governed how sacred spaces were designed and decorated. Some researchers see parallels with later snake cults known from various Near Eastern civilizations: fertility symbols, associations with healing and transformation. The connection between snakes and the underworld that appears in cultures from Greece to Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. Others point to the positioning of these sites within the landscape, noting that they're often placed at locations with commanding views or near sources of water, suggesting they served functions beyond purely ritual purposes. Perhaps they were also territorial markers, sacred sites that define the boundaries between different groups hunting and gathering territories. In an era before written treaties or formal borders, religious architecture might have served as neutral ground, places where disputes could be resolved, marriages arranged, and knowledge shared without the constant threat of violence. The fact that we find no evidence of fortification at these sites, no defensive walls or weaponry hoards, lends support to this interpretation. These were places of gathering, not of warfare, monuments to cooperation rather than conquest. And then there are the legends, the stories still told in mountain villages near these sites, tales of giants who once walked the high plateaus, shaping stone with their bare hands. Now, before you dismiss this as mere folklore, consider that oral traditions often preserve kernels of historical truth, distorted and mythologized over countless retellings, but not entirely invented. When villagers say giants built the ancient stones, are they preserving a folk memory of people who seemed giant-like in their capabilities, in their ability to move and carve stones in ways that later generations couldn't replicate? Or are they referencing something more literal? Several early excavations at Neolithic sites across Turkey and the Near East reported finding unusually large skeletal remains, individuals who would have stood significantly taller than the average person of their era. Most of these reports come from the 19th and early 20th centuries, an era of less rigorous archaeological methodology, and many of the skeletal remains were never properly preserved or studied. But the persistence of these accounts across different sites and different time periods makes you wonder if there might have been populations or individuals with unusual physical characteristics that contributed to the construction of these sites. Modern genetics has revealed that archaic human populations were more diverse than previously thought, with gene flow between Neolithic Anatolians and various other populations creating combinations of traits that might have resulted in unusual phenotypes. Could some individuals or family lines have possessed exceptional height or strength, making them natural leaders in construction projects? It's not as far-fetched as it might sound. Even today, certain populations show statistical tendencies toward greater height or more robust builds, and artificial selection through preferential mating with individuals who possess desirable traits could have amplified these characteristics. If communities developing monumental architecture preferentially valued and supported individuals with the strength and size to work with massive stones. Over generations, you might have ended up with lineages of particularly large, strong people who became specialists in megalithic construction, their exceptional abilities gradually transforming an oral tradition into stories of giants. Picture yourself at Göbekli Tepe on the summer solstice, the sun reaching its highest point in the sky before beginning its long retreat toward winter. The stone pillars cast short, stark shadows, and the air shimmers with heat rising from bare rock. You've climbed here with others from distant valleys, carrying offerings of obsidian blades and woven textiles, prepared to participate in rituals passed down through generations. The shamans or priests, whatever term best captures their role, stand among the pillars, their faces painted with ochre and ash. They begin to chant, and the sound fills the carved chambers, echoing off stone walls until it seems the earth itself is singing. You feel connected to something vast, something that stretches back to your great-grandparents' great-grandparents and forward to descendants you'll never meet. The pillars, with their carved animals and mysterious symbols, seem to watch, to remember, to carry the accumulated knowledge of your people in their silent stone faces. What knowledge? We can only guess. Agricultural techniques, perhaps, or star lore that helped predict the seasons, medicinal plants and their uses, the boundaries of different groups' territories and the proper protocols for crossing them, mythology that explained creation, death, and transformation. All of this could have been encoded in the carvings, in the arrangement of structures, in rituals performed at specific times of year when the sun or stars aligned in particular ways with the architecture. We still don't know the full extent of these mountain megalithic complexes, don't know how many more sites lie beneath the soil waiting to be discovered. We don't know if each site represents a different community's sacred space, or if they're all part of a single, vast ritual landscape that stretched across the region. We don't know what specific beliefs these structures embodied or what events in the annual cycle they commemorated. And we certainly don't know what happened to cause the eventual abandonment of this tradition, whether it was a gradual shift as agriculture transformed social organization or a more dramatic rupture, a crisis of faith or resources that made the old ways untenable. What we do know is that the Taurus Mountains hold archaeological treasures that are only now being properly investigated, that each excavation season brings new discoveries that complicate our understanding of the Neolithic, and that somewhere in the patterns of carved stone and positioned pillars lies a code we haven't fully cracked, a message from our distant ancestors about what mattered most to them as they stood on the threshold between hunting and farming, between nomadic wandering and settled civilization. The plateau of Alaka in north-central Anatolia presents yet another facet of Turkey's prehistoric enigmas, though this one comes from a slightly later period, the Early Bronze Age, roughly 2500 to 2000 BCE. Here, archaeologists have uncovered royal tombs containing artifacts of such sophistication and beauty that they challenge assumptions about the development of metallurgy, art, and social stratification in ancient Anatolia. The site itself has been continuously occupied from the Chalcolithic period through various phases of Hittite civilization. But it's the pre-Hittite royal cemetery that captures the imagination and raises the most questions. These tombs contain the remains of individuals buried with extraordinary wealth, gold diadems and jewelry, bronze weapons of exceptional craftsmanship, and most intriguingly, a series of ceremonial standards, metalwork sculptures mounted on poles, depicting bulls, stags, and solar discs with such artistic sophistication that they wouldn't look out of place in a museum of modern art. The standards themselves are masterpieces of lost wax casting, a technique that requires considerable metallurgical knowledge. The process involves creating a wax model of the desired object, encasing it in clay, heating the clay until the wax melts and drains out, then pouring molten bronze into the cavity left behind. It's technically demanding, requiring precise control of temperatures and materials, and the results at Alakahoyuk demonstrate absolute mastery of the craft. The bulls are anatomically accurate, their musculature rendered with attention to detail that speaks to careful observation of living animals. The stags are posed in mid-leap, captured in moments of dynamic motion that shouldn't be possible in solid bronze. And the solar discs, perforated geometric patterns surrounding central circles, demonstrate mathematical precision and aesthetic sense that combine functional design with symbolic meaning we can only partially decode. But here's what makes this site particularly puzzling. These tombs date to a period before the Hittite Empire, before we have clear written records for this region, representing a culture whose name we don't even know. The Hittites, who would later dominate Anatolia from roughly 1650 to 1200 BCE, clearly knew about Alakahoyuk and considered it sacred. They maintained religious buildings there and left their own artifacts. But they weren't the ones who created the royal cemetery. Someone else, some earlier culture with sophisticated social organization and advanced metalworking skills, occupied this site and built monumental tombs for their elite. The wealth concentrated in these burials suggests a stratified society with significant surplus resources, enough to support specialist craftspeople who dedicated their time to creating ceremonial objects rather than producing food. It also suggests trade networks that brought in raw materials from distant sources. The gold likely came from mines in Armenia or western Anatolia, the copper from various sources across the region, the tin from as far away as Afghanistan, or possibly from sources in the Taurus Mountains. Think about the implications. By 2500 BCE, someone in central Anatolia was organizing long-distance trade, smelting and alloying metals to create bronze, developing artistic traditions, and building monumental architecture. This might not seem remarkable until you consider that we're talking about a time when Egypt was in the early stages of the Old Kingdom, when Mesopotamian cities were warring for dominance, when most of Europe was still working with stone and copper tools. Anatolia, often treated as a backwater in Near Eastern archaeology, was clearly a center of innovation and wealth, home to cultures that could rival their more famous neighbors in technical skill and artistic achievement. Yet we don't know what they called themselves, don't have their creation myths or king lists, don't know if they developed writing or kept their records through other means. The material culture speaks eloquently of their capabilities, but the culture itself remains nameless, known only through the objects they left behind. Some researchers have proposed links between the people of Alakahoyuk and the later Hattians, a culture known to have preceded the Hittites in central Anatolia, and from whom the Hittites borrowed religious practices and deities. If this connection holds, it would suggest continuity of population and tradition extending back at least 1,000 years before the Hittite takeover, a long lineage of culture and craft maintained through generations. Others point to the solar symbolism in the ceremonial standards and suggest connections to sun-worshipping traditions found across Indo-European cultures, proposing that Alaksa Hoyuk might represent early evidence of Indo-European religious practices in Anatolia. The problem with both theories is the same. We don't have enough evidence to definitively link the material culture of the early Bronze Age cemetery with any later group. The objects are silent on matters of language, belief, and identity, beautiful in their craftsmanship but frustratingly mute about the people who made them. And then there are the more speculative interpretations, theories that gain traction in alternative archaeology circles even if they're regarded skeptically by mainstream scholars. Some point to the sophistication of the metallurgy and the apparent sudden appearance of bronze-working expertise as evidence of technology transfer from a more advanced civilization, perhaps through trade contact with Near Eastern cultures that had developed metallurgy earlier. Or possibly, and here's where eyebrows raise in academic circles, from cultures that have left fewer archaeological traces but possessed advanced technical knowledge. The idea of lost civilizations that developed high technologies only to vanish from history is a persistent theme in fringe archaeology, and sites like Alaksa Hoyuk, where we see obvious sophistication emerging from what appears to be a less developed context, feed into these narratives. The reality is probably more prosaic, but no less interesting. Human innovation doesn't proceed in neat, linear fashion, and small populations with the right combination of resources, trade contacts, and cultural emphasis on craft can develop impressive capabilities even if surrounding regions remain at different technological levels. Now, let's be fair. There's also something unsettling about the Royal Cemetery at Alaksa Hoyuk, something the sanitized museum displays and archaeological reports downplay. These tombs contained not just the bodies of elite individuals, but also sacrificed animals, bulls, sheep, dogs, and in some cases, what appear to be retainers, people buried alongside their rulers to serve them in the afterlife. The practice of human sacrifice in royal burials is well documented across various ancient cultures, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to China, but it's always a stark reminder that sophistication in art and technology doesn't necessarily correlate with values that modern people would recognize as humane. These were cultures that could create beauty. The bronze standards are genuinely beautiful objects, but also cultures that considered some human lives expendable, tools to be used up in the service of the powerful. The contrast is jarring, forcing us to confront the fact that our ancestors, however clever and creative, were also capable of cruelty that we've hopefully evolved beyond. Picture yourself as a metalworker in early Bronze Age Alaksa Hoyuk, your hands stained with ash and metal oxides, your workshop filled with crucibles and molds and the acrid smell of hot bronze. You've been commissioned to create a ceremonial standard for a king's burial, a solar disk that will accompany him into the afterlife and, more immediately, will demonstrate your patron's wealth and power to anyone who attends the funeral. You've spent weeks perfecting the wax model, getting each ray of the sun exactly right, ensuring the perforation pattern is symmetrically perfect. Now comes the terrifying moment, pouring the molten bronze. If the temperature is wrong, if there's a flaw in the mold, if any moisture has contaminated the clay, the casting will fail and you'll have to start over, wasting precious time and material. But you've done this before. You know the signs, and when the bronze flows into the mold and solidifies without incident, you feel that surge of pride that craftspeople have felt throughout history, the satisfaction of technique mastered, of materials bent to human will, of creating something that will outlast you by millennia. What you don't know as you polish the finished piece until it gleams like captured sunlight is that 4,000 years later, archaeologists will handle your work with gloved reverence, that your creation will rest in museum cases, that scholars will debate what it meant and who you were. You're just trying to eat, to maintain your family, to honor the commission that's been given to you. But in doing so, you've created immortality. not for yourself, whose name is lost, but for the skill and vision you possessed, preserved in bronze. We still don't know the full story of Alaka-Hoyuk, don't know who the people in those tombs were, or what dramas of alliance and conquest led to their burial with such ceremony. We don't know if the site represented a regional capital or a sacred center where rulers from various settlements came to be interred. We don't know what happened to their culture, whether it was absorbed by the Hittites or destroyed by them or simply evolved through natural cultural drift until it became something else. What we do know is that Bronze Age Anatolia was far more complex and sophisticated than traditional narratives suggested, that its craftspeople possessed skills that rivaled those of better-known civilizations, and that beneath the Turkish plateau lie countless more sites waiting to tell their stories, waiting for archaeologists with the time and funding to carefully excavate their secrets and add new chapters to the human story. The extraordinary sophistication of Turkey's prehistoric megastructures forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about progress, about what we mean when we talk about primitive and advanced, about the linear narratives we've constructed to explain human development. Standing before the monolithic pillars of Göbekli Tepe, descending into the engineered depths of Derinkuyu, examining the bronze masterpieces of Alaka-Hoyuk, we're confronted with evidence that sophistication, technical, artistic, organizational, emerged much earlier and more completely than we've wanted to admit. The comfortable story of gradual, linear progress from simple to complex, from crude to refined, from superstitious to rational, doesn't hold up when you're touching stones carved 11,000 years ago by people who supposedly knew nothing but hunting and gathering. These Turkish sites scattered across the Anatolian highlands, like pieces of a puzzle we've barely begun to assemble, represent something profound about human capability and human drive. They tell us that the impulse to create, to build monuments that outlast individual lifetimes, to encode knowledge in stone and metal and earth, is fundamental to our nature. Our ancestors 11,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, possessed the same cognitive hardware we have today, the same capacity for abstract thought, for planning across generations, for organizing collective effort toward goals that wouldn't be realized within any single person's lifetime. What they lacked wasn't intelligence or imagination, but accumulated knowledge, the vast body of technical information and cultural capital that each generation adds to the sum of human understanding. Yet, even without that accumulated knowledge, without the benefit of thousands of years of documented experimentation and discovery, they managed to create works that continue to inspire and puzzle us millennia later. There's something deeply moving about standing in the presence of these ancient structures, something that transcends academic interest or archaeological curiosity. You feel the weight of time, yes, but you also feel connection. These were people, human beings with the same fundamental drives and fears and hopes that motivate us today. They worried about food and safety, about their children's futures, about what happens after death. They wondered about the cosmos, about patterns they saw in the stars and seasons, about forces beyond their control that brought rain or drought, abundance or famine. And they responded to those concerns not with resignation, but with action, with monumental action, creating structures and artifacts that declared their presence, their beliefs, their refusal to simply accept the world as they found it. Every carved pillar at Göbekli Tepe, every tunnel excavated at Derinkuyu, every bronze casting at Alaka-Hoyuk represents hours of human labor, thousands upon thousands of hours aggregated across generations, all driven by the conviction that the effort mattered, that what they built would serve purposes important enough to justify the immense expenditure of time and resources. And yet, for all our modern technology, for all our archaeological techniques and scientific instruments, we still can't fully answer the most basic questions about these sites. We can date them, more or less. We can describe them, cataloging every stone and artifact. We can theorize about their purposes, constructing elaborate hypotheses supported by comparative analysis of other cultures and sites. But we can't truly know what it meant to participate in building Göbekli Tepe, can't fully understand the beliefs that made carving an underground city seem not just reasonable, but necessary, can't experience the worldview that created such extraordinary bronze art. That knowledge died with the last person who held it, and no amount of excavation will bring it fully back to life. We're left with material remains, with the mute testimony of stone and metal, interpreting as best we can, but always aware that we're seeing through a glass darkly, reconstructing ancient realities from fragmentary evidence and cultural assumptions that may or may not apply. This incompleteness, this fundamental uncertainty, is actually part of what makes these mysteries so compelling. If we knew everything, if every question had a definitive answer, the sites would become merely historical curiosities, interesting but closed, chapters of the past that held no ambiguity. But because so much remains unknown, because each answer raises new questions, these Turkish megastructures stay alive in a sense, active participants in ongoing conversations about who we are and where we came from. They challenge us to remain humble about our assumptions, to remember that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, that the map of human achievement is far larger and more complex than the territory we've managed to document. Every season brings new excavations, new discoveries that shift the landscape of what we know. Ground-penetrating radar reveals structures still buried at sites we thought were fully explored. New dating techniques push timelines back further than previous estimates suggested. Analysis of ancient DNA reveals population movements and mixtures we didn't suspect. The story is never finished, never complete, always subject to revision based on the next discovery. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Turkey's prehistoric megastructures, not any specific fact about dates or cultures or construction techniques, but the broader understanding that human history is vastly deeper and more mysterious than we generally acknowledge. We like to think we've figured out the past, that the textbooks and museum placards represent settled knowledge, but the truth is that we're still in the early stages of understanding our species' journey. For every question we answer about ancient sites, we uncover evidence that raises 10 more questions. For every mystery we solve, we discover 3 more mysteries we didn't know existed. This isn't a failure of archaeology or historical method. It's the natural result of investigating a subject, human prehistory, that spans hundreds of thousands of years across every inhabited continent, most of which was lived by people who left no written records, whose stories survive only in the objects they made and the structures they built and the genetic traces they left in their descendants. So when you think about Göbekli Tepe, don't just think about carved pillars and T-shaped stones. Think about the people who quarried that stone, who figured out how to transport multi-ton blocks without draft animals or wheeled vehicles, who developed the artistic vision to cover pillars with intricate animal reliefs, who organized communities to support specialist craftspeople for generations. When you think about Derinkuyu, don't just think about tunnels and stone doors. Think about the families who lived there, children playing in carved passages their grandparents excavated, communities maintaining elaborate ventilation systems they inherited from ancestors whose names they'd forgotten. When you think about Alaka Hoyuk, don't just think about bronze artifacts in museum cases. Think about the metallurgist's satisfaction at a perfect casting, the mourners who buried their king with treasures meant to ease his journey to the afterlife, the cultural continuity that maintained sacred sites across centuries, and political upheavals. These sites are not just archaeological puzzles to be solved or tourist attractions to be visited. They're connections to the deepest roots of human civilization, evidence of capacities and achievements that predate recorded history, but that fundamentally shape the trajectory our species followed. They remind us that sophistication and simplicity are not opposites, but can coexist in the same time and place, that our ancestors were capable of extraordinary things, even in conditions we'd consider primitive. They challenge us to think about what else might be out there, waiting beneath the soil in places we haven't thought to look, or haven't had the resources to properly excavate. And they invite us to wonder about what will happen to our own civilizational achievements, what future archaeologists millennia hence might conclude about us based on fragmentary evidence and misunderstood artifacts. The Anatolian Plateau holds its secrets close, releasing them grudgingly, one excavation season at a time. Beneath the wheat fields and villages, beneath the tourist paths and conservation fences, lie the material remains of cultures whose stories we're only beginning to read. Some of what we'll discover will confirm existing theories, filling in details of narratives we've already sketched. But some of it, if history is any guide, will be completely unexpected, challenging fundamental assumptions and forcing us to redraw the maps of ancient human achievement. That's the nature of archaeology, the frustration and the thrill of it. You never know what the next carefully brushed away layer of soil will reveal. You never know if the next season will bring routine confirmation or revolutionary discovery. And you never know if you're looking at the last remnant of a known culture or the first evidence of a completely unknown one. So keep digging, metaphorically, if not literally. Keep asking questions about the past. Keep seeking out the mysteries that conventional narratives gloss over. Keep wondering about the people who came before us and what they knew, and what they built, and what they believed. The secrets are out there, quite literally beneath your feet if you're standing anywhere in Turkey, waiting for curious minds and patient investigation to bring them back to light. Some secrets have waited 11,000 years already. They can wait a bit longer for the right person with the right questions to find them. But they won't wait forever. Time and weather and human development are constantly eroding the evidence, destroying potential sites before we even know they exist. Every year, some piece of the puzzle is lost before we have a chance to study it. So the work is urgent, the questions are pressing, and the mysteries, ancient, beautiful, frustrating mysteries, continue to call to us across the millennia, inviting us to understand, to connect, to remember that we are all part of the same long human story that began in the African savanna and spread across the globe, leaving behind these extraordinary monuments to our species' restless, creative, endlessly fascinating journey through time.